January 1944, Rabaul, New Britain. Rain hammered the tin roofs of the Japanese 8th Area Army headquarters. Beneath the rattling storm, a group of officers gathered around a smudged map of the Pacific. A young captain from the 14th Tank Regiment leaned forward, squinting at a grainy reconnaissance photograph of an American vehicle that intelligence had labeled the M4. "A children's toy," one officer muttered. The others chuckled. The photograph, taken from a captured U.S. pamphlet, showed a squat, rounded tank with a short 75mm gun and a high, boxy profile. To Japanese eyes, accustomed to the long-barreled Type 97 Chiha or the lighter Hago, it looked absurdly overweight. The Imperial Army had fought in China's river valleys and Burma's mountains with small, nimble machines. They didn't need lumbering beasts to crush mud walls or bamboo huts. "Imagine this thing in the jungle," Colonel Sakae Yamamoto said, tapping the photo with his pipe. "It will sink before it fights." Laughter followed, but a few men stayed silent. Among them was Lieutenant Kenji Morita, a veteran of Guadalcanal, where he had watched U.S. firepower melt through Japanese lines like a torch through wax. He remembered the thunder of American naval guns and the strange, rhythmic thud of tanks rolling unseen beyond the palms. "Do not underestimate their machines," he whispered, almost to himself. The others didn't hear him, or didn't care. By the time the meeting ended, the officers had filed their report to Tokyo. Enemy tank. Slow, lightly armored, unsuitable for jungle operations. No threat to Japanese defenses. 6 months later, that same toy would grind its way through Saipan's coral hills and bury that arrogance under its treads. June 15, 1944, Saipan, Northern Marianas. At 5:42 a.m., the horizon caught fire. The U.S. Navy unleashed the kind of bombardment no Japanese soldier had ever imagined. Battleships Tennessee and California poured 14-inch shells into the beaches, while carrier planes stitched the ridgelines with rockets. Hidden in trenches above the shore, Lieutenant Morita pressed his helmet against the dirt. The earth shook, and through the smoke, he saw them, dark shapes crawling from the surf. Not infantry, not amphibious tractors, tanks. The first M4 Shermans of the 2nd Marine Tank Battalion rolled forward, tracks clattering over coral. Sunlight glinted off their turrets as they climbed the dunes like patient, iron beasts. Morita's machine gun crew fired. Bullets sparked harmlessly off thick armor. He shouted for the anti-tank gun. The Type 147mm cannon barked, once, twice, and both shells bounced away with a ringing clang. The tank answered with a deafening roar. The 75mm gun cracked, and the Japanese bunker vanished in a cloud of dust and shattered coral. Within minutes, the Marines had a dozen Shermans ashore. They moved like machines from another world, coordinated, relentless, their engines rumbling like thunder across the island. Infantry followed in their wake, using the tanks for cover as they advanced inland. "Where is the weakness?" Morita yelled to his men, but there was none. The M4's armor shrugged off the light shells that Japan's defenses had relied on since 1939. Their bunkers, designed for infantry assaults, became tombs under the tank's high-explosive shells. By nightfall, the sound of engines echoed through the jungle, a mechanical heartbeat pulsing toward Mount Tapachau. For the first time, Japanese troops realized the Americans had built a tank not for the plains of Europe, but for the impossible terrain of the Pacific. The tiny Sherman didn't sink. It devoured the island. October 22, 1944, Leyte Island, Philippines. Rain fell in silver sheets across the paddies. The 767th Tank Battalion's Shermans crept along muddy trails, engines whining, hulls caked in clay. Inside one tank, Sergeant Thomas Red Garvey wiped sweat from his brow. The air reeked of oil, gunpowder, and fear. "Jesus, this mud's thicker than breakfast oatmeal," his driver muttered. Ahead, the road curved toward a grove of palm trees, and suddenly exploded in fire. Japanese Type 95 tanks lay in wait, their 37mm guns blazing. Shells slammed into Garvey's lead tank, denting the armor but failing to penetrate. Garvey swung the turret, sighted through the scope, and fired. The first round turned a Hago into a fireball. The second caught another as it tried to retreat into the trees. Flames spread through the underbrush. "Keep moving," Garvey shouted. The Shermans advanced, crushing bamboo huts and palm trunks beneath their tracks. By sunset, the jungle glowed orange. Shermans fired point-blank into caves where Japanese soldiers had dug themselves in. Flamethrower variants, the Zippos, spat arcs of fire that turned entire ridges into molten light. Lieutenant Morita, now with the 1st Division, watched helplessly from his foxhole. His radio crackled with reports of entire defensive lines overrun by tanks they had once mocked. "They fight like ships on land," one soldier cried before the signal died. The irony cut deep. Japan's armored doctrine had been built around maneuver, not endurance. Against the American steel Leviathan, mobility meant nothing. The Sherman wasn't just stronger, it was many. The U.S. could replace every loss, Japan could not. Morita clutched his sword, the emblem of a warrior's pride, and stared into the fire. The tanks roared past like ghosts of an industrial world Japan had failed to match. March 1945, Luzon. When the last Japanese holdouts emerged from the jungle, the war had already turned to ash. Among the wreckage lay burned-out Shermans, and dozens more still running, engines idling beside the rice paddies. To the villagers who watched them roll by, these machines were symbols of invincibility, the embodiment of American industry that could cross oceans, conquer jungles, and never run out of fuel. For men like Lieutenant Morita, captured and hollow-eyed, the lesson was carved into memory. "We built for honor," he told an American correspondent through an interpreter. "You built for forever." The Sherman, mocked as tiny in Tokyo's war rooms, had become the iron pulse of a global war. It wasn't the fastest, or the thickest, or the most fearsome, but it was everywhere. In the Pacific, it had turned coral and jungle into highways of victory. As the guns fell silent, one truth echoed through the ruins of Saipan, Leyte, and Luzon. In a war fought across oceans, it wasn't the biggest tank that mattered, but the one that kept moving.